Disability studies, health justice, and AI. Just to clarify, we are recording these seminar series just for distribution on our YouTube channel, and we're not going to be recording the Q&A. But if we would really encourage that if you don't want to be recorded, that you just pop your video off so that you don't show up on the recording. But yes, the reason why we were really keen to have this particular session on disability studies and health justice and AI is because I think we're in a particular moment of AI hype where there is a huge emphasis on the ability that AI is going to automate away lots and lots of different kinds of health conditions caused by structural and systemic inequality. I think one of the conversations where this is most foregrounded is around AI and mental health, where all manner of different tech products, particularly chatbots and other kinds of social AI, are posited as the solution for kind of deep structural crises of loneliness and connectivity in our societies. And I think that this idea that AI is going to solve loneliness is incredibly nebulous and potentially very dangerous. And so, what we wanted to do in this session was bring together scholars and experts working from one of the most important fields of study in this area, disability studies and crip theory, to think about AI and health, not just in the kind of framing or perspective of like what can AI do for our health, but kind of more broadly to actually zoom out and say maybe that's not the right question, and rather what does kind of AI and the contemporary state of the tech industry show us about kind of the broader state of health justice, and like what kinds of changes do we need for kind of to have a more just society when it comes to health and kind of more broadly our wellness on a kind of societal and political level. And so I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Amy Gaeta. And so Amy will be presenting a talk called Diagnostics, Advertisements, Social Media, Surveillance, and Targeted Health Marketing. And Amy is a research associate at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. She uses feminist theory, queer theory, and critical disability studies to analyze the emotional, aesthetic, and political dimensions of human and technology relations, especially those regarding consumer and military drones. Amy's research is deeply concerned with how semi-autonomous technologies impact the formation of subjecthood and ideas of humanness. Amy is strongly committed to the aims of disability justice, many of which inform her work as a researcher, activist, and poet. And Amy will also be doing our access statement for today's session. So fantastic. Thank you so much, Amy. And we'll now hand over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction, Kerry. So I'm just going to get my slides set up really quickly and share my screen and do a quick tech check. Dun, dun, dun. Am I? Okay. And can people view my slides okay? Giant purple screen. Excellent. All right. Let me get my slides with notes. Excellent. Yeah, so I want to start here with our access note. So as much as this can be, I want to make sure this is an accessible digital and virtual space for us all. So that may mean very different things to all of us. It may mean that you shut your camera off. It may mean you mute yourself. It may mean that you only use the chat to communicate, that you get up and walk around, you take a drink. I just want you to feel free to be able to use your body mind in whatever way that is for you within the next hour and a half and not feel glued to your screen. And likewise, for me as a presenter, please tell me if I need to speak more loudly or more slowly, or if I say something and you don't know the word, etc. Feel free to just type something in the chat and I will address it as I'm speaking. Or if one of the organizers could just flag to me to speak louder or whatnot. Yes, yeah, so that is our access note. I think by now, hopefully, after many years of Zoom, we feel pretty comfortable on it. Yeah, so I'm going to start with my talk here today. So this is a talk about the experience of seeing targeted advertisements for health products and services on your personal social media account. So I'll show some examples of these in a minute. If you use social media, you probably experience these in some way. And then I'm going to use a critical disability studies lens to think about how do these ads implicate disability, what do they mean for end users, and how do they shift people's sense of self and sense of their own body mind. So there's a few things about me that I'd like you to know for this talk today. I will be talking about my own data profile and experiences on social media. So in the spirit of fairness, there's a few things you should know is one, I'm extremely online. I have been extremely online for a long time. I'm multiply disabled, and I mainly use social media quite heavily to talk about disability issues on a personal level, a political level. And I also use social media to stay in touch with a lot of disability justice groups, as well as disability communities. So that will show you what kind of algorithms seem to generate towards me. So this talk today, I wrote originally in 2023 as an article version, and then it was published in a special issue in First Monday. That was published in 2023. It's open access, and that was edited by the brilliant Grayson Brillmeyer and Crystal Lee, and that was on the intersections of disability studies and information studies. And this really originated from two experiences. One was using social media, mainly Instagram, as a disabled person and working in the field of disability studies, and also engaging in these other debates that weren't happening on social media, but in disability studies on how do we define disability, and how do we explain the production of disability as a category, as an identity, but also as a material reality for many people. And my aim today is to first explain this project and then start imagining how I'm going to build it outwards and think more critically about how surveillance regimes in particular implicate, create, and project disability. So really, I started thinking about this in 2018 when I began to notice a growing number of ads for health products, treatments, and paid studies on my social media feeds. A notable example was when I still used Facebook. I would always get this paid survey that said, "We need your expert insight on mobility aids." And I was really intrigued. So I would click through these and, surveys, and then they would try to vet me for my preferred wheelchair style. And then a week later, I would get a series of other advertisements, such as an extra large alarm clock for people with hearing impairments, vision aid devices, postpartum depression support, and nutritional counseling. So in many ways, since I'm disabled, it makes sense why they might kind of sell me these products. But none of these disabilities aligned with my experience at all. I've never used a wheelchair. I don't have any hearing or vision impairments. So I found this quite ironic that a website that documents every event and relationship in my life could have such a skewed idea of how my body mind operates and how I identify as disabled or not. So I was really intrigued by the slipperiness between how these social media platforms seem to understand my body and the actual experience of my body. So I started reading into targeted advertising. So we're probably familiar with some version of targeted advertising, but basically in it, online services will collect, process, and synthesize data about the behavior of users, typically based on decisions that we make online or information we share, data tracking cookies, and other strands of identificatory data. So traditionally, advertisers would buy specific spots on digital space, such as every time you log on Facebook, you're going to see this one ad for a shampoo. But now advertisers buy automated, algorithmically mediated advertising spaces that matches a product with what they think is a suitable audience. So they think this is someone that needs this product. And then they constantly reevaluate the effectiveness of the ad placement. So much has been written about targeted advertising and what it means for privacy rights and what it means for the manipulation of our online experience. But less is explored, as I'll think about today, is how these targeted advertisements for health products in particular take the form of an implicit diagnosis. So by pairing users with these particular health products and services, the implication is that the users need those products. And that assumed need, these ads seem to suggest, is the result of physical or mental impairment or difference from the norm. So next, I'm going to show you one of these ads. And I want to add the caveat that I had a big computer crash in 2023, and I lost the original ads that I collected for this. So the ads that I'm showing you are for the same services that I use that advertise to me, but not the exact ad. But I will describe the ads that I was particularly subjected to. So one of the ads I was sold to a lot was from a company called Alike Health, which is a social media platform that connects users based on the similarity of their health profiles. And this advertising had big like block letters, and it said, you are 94% alike. Get matched with friends who get your medical reality. And below it, there were all these little smiley faces who were supposed to be my friends or my online community. And there was a big circle that said you. And then next to this graphic, there were 3 words that were, I guess, suggested to potentially relate to me. And those 3 words were anxiety, fibromyalgia, and insomnia. And a week later, I saw the exact same ad, except this time there were different medical conditions, including diabetes, anxiety, and borderline personality disorder. So these are the kinds of ads that I'm talking about. So when I think about these ads as operating as a form of diagnosis, I started to think about what would it mean if an advertisement was diagnostic or an advertisement was diagnosing me. And I developed the concept of diagnostic advertisements. And I chose this term quite purposely to think about how diagnosis and algorithms share very similar logics. So conceptually speaking, diagnosis is similar to algorithms, and that each is a step-by-step process of inputting information into a preset design in order to receive a certain output or desired end. Oftentimes, diagnosis and algorithms are also defined as formulas used to fix a problem. In the case of diagnosis, the problem is me, I guess. The problem is the medical condition. And there's a whole bunch of issues with that framing as well that disability studies have tackled. But the result of a diagnosis of this process is ultimately a label, one that is given to the patient and comes to deeply influence how they see themselves, but also how they're treated by wider society. And it gains a sense of authority, not only because of the person, the medical community giving that diagnosis, but it also obscures degrees of subjectivity and room for error, where a diagnosis is seen as something finalized. It's something that's respected by the state, by institutions. So it is hard to combat them. And in very times, it reminds me of discussions we have about algorithms and the perceived objectivity of them. So the algorithms I discuss here today are not engaging in the traditional medical diagnosis process. But of course, as some of my co-panelists might discuss, algorithms have long been used in diagnostic processes in medicine. So I had this project where I wanted to understand, how do these ads shift your sense of self as a disabled person or as a non-disabled person? And I was very stuck on method. So one of my arguments for this project was actually my method, where I felt like I needed to develop a new method in order to do this project ethically, and in order to do it in a way that foregrounds disabled knowledge. So naturally, I started with myself and my personal experience. So I collected targeted advertisements that appeared on my Instagram feed for 3 months between March and May 2022. And I accessed this via my smartphone when I lived in the United States still. And I primarily just used Instagram, which I used for about 2 hours a day. And I shut off all privacy options and all tracking options. I also made my account public. And I used it as I normally would, really. So I would use it to communicate with friends, follow meme accounts, silly things like that. I wanted to get the most organic experience possible. I saw about 30 advertisements a day. Most of them were just about kind of beauty products, clothing, TV, social life. And then I did get a good selection of ones for physical and mental health products. Apart from some diet food products, the majority of those ads were health products that would keep me online, such as telehealth services, therapy, journaling apps, and nutrition trackers. So I chose this method because I really wanted something that would let me value self-exposure to these ads, and also to let me sit with the kind of intimacy of surveillance, and to think about what kind of emotions that I have, and really what are these doing to me. And I didn't feel it was ethical to ask anyone else to do that kind of work with something as intimately as, how do these ads make you renegotiate your body? So 2 things kind of inspired this method, which I'm calling CRIP auto theory. So CRIP, if you're not familiar, is a framework and political orientation from disability studies. So a CRIP approach is This is arguable. It's a big debate in the field as to what it is. I usually think of it as a methodology that seeks out and imagines value systems that are not built around ability. So it forces us to see mechanisms and ideologies that render certain bodies as the opposite of normal and that determine their value purely based on ability. So instead of normative notions of ability, a CRIP approach is going to look at certain kinds of qualities that have historically been marked as unimportant and unvaluable. So this might be slowness, inertness, passivity, and other things seen as unproductive. So methodologically, this meant I'm going to be as kind of passive as possible to these ads. I'm not going to try to put up any defense or impose any distance. So then I blended this with auto theory, which is a form of hybrid writing that blends theorizing with personal experience and embodied knowledge. And central to auto theory is that the scene of writing is also part of knowledge production, not simply knowledge reporting. So by cripping auto theory, as I'm trying to do here, one, I want to foreground my experience as a disabled person, and two, center the value of passivity and partiality. So I thought the merit of this approach is going to be refusing academic fantasies of completeness, of objectivity, and really immersing myself in the research field, and hopefully trying to dismantle this research or objective study binary. And this was really inspired by a lot of feminist decolonial approaches to autoethnography, as it is kind of standing in resistance to a longstanding silencing of disabled knowledge and disabled scholars in the academy, and just kind of affirming their rightful act in knowledge production. I also thought that an auto theory approach is really suited to the study of algorithms. So algorithms are not stable objects by any means, that you can reveal some kind of consistent logic. So obviously we know Instagram is not transparent about how its algorithms work in terms of placing these ads. But even if they were really transparent, this knowledge would ultimately still be complete because, as Nick Seaver has argued, the scope of algorithms exceed the visibility of any single person. When we start to think about algorithms as socio-technical assemblages, which include everything from the algorithm itself, its model, the hardware that hosts it, the data, the outputs, and then the network of human actors that are involved in designing it, running it, and maintaining it. So I was also really inspired by Tanya Butcher's work on the black box problem in algorithms. And she argues that we don't necessarily need to be able to know exactly how these algorithms work. And maybe that isn't the best aim. But instead, maybe we can create new kind of methodological approaches that allow for us to operate around the black box and think of other ways of trying to see inside it. So to that point, I developed CRIP auto theory as a way to look at diagnostic advertisements and think about how do audiences process and embody the contradictory nature of the wide-ranging effects of health advertising algorithms. So I want to think here about what does it mean to embrace the partial, embrace the contradictory, incomplete, or even irrational knowledges, and really take those to heart. So next, I'm just going to kind of go through three things that I mainly thought about for this, and then some future research plans. So in terms of things I learned about this, I thought a lot about diagnosis more properly. So many of you know that that diagnosis are pretty heavy labels in the disability community, as they are for anyone. They're quite loaded, as in a diagnosis is not just a label, but it is a passport in many ways. And it can provide or bar access to certain treatments, programs, social expectations, and more. So these are kind of volatile topic. There are certain diagnoses I have really celebrated because they've affirmed my body experience. But these diagnoses have also deeply influenced the way health providers look at me and have not taken me seriously or taken me more seriously. And the stigma attached to various diagnoses can be particularly higher, depending on the demographic of the patient and as well as their geographic positioning and the cultural norms around that diagnosis. So one of the things that is unique here about kind of traditional diagnoses and the diagnostic advertisements I'm discussing here is the social media feed. So by interjecting these diagnoses into my feed, there was a deep sense of intimacy and personalization, even if it was unwanted. So on one level, I was extremely excited to see disability be very public and see it be kind of interjected into the feeds of maybe thousands of people. And in many ways, my relationship with diagnosis shaped the way that I saw these. So while I had many good experiences with diagnosis, this did create issues. So when ads would make incorrect assumptions about my body, I would get very curious about whether or not these ads were right. So the more ads I saw, the more I wondered, could I have borderline personality disorder? What about my data says that I'm pre-diabetic? And why does Instagram think I'm depressed? Am I depressed? So these are more than just diagnoses, right? These are an integral part of identity formation. And even if that identity may not match with your physiological reality, it is something that informs it, even if incorrect, is one of the things I want to think about. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to talk about Instagram's ad system. But as you can imagine, there is very much we do not know about Instagram's ad system. The only thing we really do know via Meta, Instagram's owner, is that it is illegal for health agencies, pharmacies, et cetera, to sell personal data to Meta that they could use to target users by health status or condition, right? So they never know what my actual health status is based on information or data sent to them by health agencies. So they have to infer that data by a set of behavioral and identificatory markers. So we have one, thinking about kind of diagnosis, more intimacy, and kind of what I disguise as a virtual doctor's office. And the second thing I want to think about is the medicalization of everyday life. And this is one of the things that kind of most disturbed me, I guess, about this. But the heavy use of these advertisements, for me, speak to this larger issue of the intensification of everyday life being medicalized, where surveillance and the commodification of personals was deeply normalized. So I was thinking here about the concept of the clinical gaze, which a very brilliant disability justice designer, Alex Haggard, has detailed. But the clinical gaze is a way of conceiving of and accrediting of disability. So when a group of symptoms or impairments, that is to say functional differences that interfere with a person's ability to be normatively productive under industrial capitalism, can be mapped to a specific tangible or somatic site of pathology. The clinical gaze accredits them as disability and seeks to correct the physical deviation is identified. So for me, this was very similar as what's going on in these ads, where you are kind of seen by these algorithms as identifying some kind of problem or deficiency in you, and these ads provide some kind of solution via a product. So for me, diagnostic advertisements reproduce and transform the clinical gaze through ultimately the vector of capitalism by looking purely at their data rather than their bodies. And by doing so, these advertisements use data to create kind of images through the lens of the clinical gaze. And these are images, not realities at the user's bodies, that then they kind of impose onto users or project onto them. I realize I am at time, so I just want to talk about two more things. And then I will, then I will plan more timely talks in the future. So the medicalization of everyday life, and what does it mean that even your data double can be a site of commodification? So the other thing I wanted to touch on was this concept of the data double. And this was thinking about a kind of informational profile that shadows each subject that is surveilled or each internet user, which is kind of a collection of a person's data that is kind of created. So it is a version of yourself based on your activity online in many ways, and inferred preferences, desires, likes, needs, etc. So I started to kind of think deeply about what does it mean that my data double is disabled in ways that I am not. And what does this mean for the category of disability ultimately, and how it is produced today if these kind of abstract data points can be used to create a disabled data double? How is that shifting the way that we think about disability as a category? So just two things I want to think about for the kind of future of this work, or what we can do with it. One is that I'm hoping that thinking about diagnostic advertisements in relation to growing cultures and markets around mental health and physical health may improve our understanding of emergent and persistent form of ableism, ultimately. So more work is needed to think about how do these advertisements contribute or reinforce to the kind of really deeply rooted racist and heterosexist criteria for how those diagnoses are developed. So how are they not, or how are they reinforcing longstanding medical biases around the creation of certain categories? I'm also interested in how do these projections of disability, this disabled data double, demedicalize, normalize, or make harmful certain disabilities over another, right? Why can I see so many ads about depression and very few ads about schizophrenia, for instance? But then my data double being disabled in ways I'm not also poses these questions about where do our bodies begin and end in the age of big data and mass surveillance. So one of the reasons I did this project was, as I said, to think about the slipperiness of the self between the data double, and also to maybe in the future think more deeply about how do these ads compromise people's decision-making, and how do platforms use these advertising algorithms to shift the norms around personal health information and privacy. So my goal is that hopefully with the right set of tools, examining these ads could be a way to work backwards to understand how are companies identifying target audiences and if they are reproducing disability tropes and stereotypes in the process. And what does that ultimately mean for the person and their experience of disability and their own epistemological basis for thinking about their body? So I had more to say about kind of limitations here, biggest limitation just being me, and the other limitation being what is often called the whiteness problem in disability studies, where we think about how do we define disability, and so often it has been through a very limited lens that speaks to where disability studies is kind of properly studied versus where knowledge about disability studies is actually lived and experienced. So I can talk about that more during Q&A if we would like, but I'm going to wrap things up now. Thank you all so much.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. I mean, I think I'm absolutely not alone in saying that that was really, really fascinating. And, I think there's, more broadly, I think this kind of societal move to seeing the algorithm as being almost kind of like scrying or a kind of divination about ourselves, where people will say like, oh, what does my algorithm say about me? And I feel like this is like such an important, interesting kind of exploration of the kind of the self-making, I guess, that emerges in relation to these diagnostic advertisements and these kind of targeted ads. So thank you so much. And I now want to move to our second speaker, Carolin Fleischer-Heininger from the German Institute for Japanese Studies, or the DIJ, who will be presenting on the topic Desirable AI for All, Approaching Future Technologies Through a Disability Studies Lens. And so Carolin is a senior research fellow at the German Institute for Japanese Studies in Tokyo. Her research is on representations of disabilities in contemporary Japanese literature. She holds a master's degree in theatre studies from the LMU, where she also completed her PhD in Japanese studies with a dissertation on constructions of post-war Japan in literary, dramatic, and cinematic works by Terayama Shuji. She received doctoral research grants from the DIJ and the DFG, and has worked as a research associate at LMU's Japan Center. So take us away.
I will start my presentation with some information on the state of debate on disability in Japan. After briefly introducing the author Ichi Kawasao and her hunchback, I will investigate how the novel, by contrasting disability and normalcy and by introducing a digital device providing access to reading as well as to social relations, depicts a physical disability. Taking this reading as a starting point, I will draft 7 hypotheses on AI and disabilities. Please allow me to give a short disclaimer beforehand. I'm not an AI specialist in any sense. My background is in theater studies and Japanese studies. My research interests include literature, theater, film in Japan since the post-war period. Nevertheless, I'm also excited to observe recent debates concerning digitalization and IA. My current research project is on representations of disabilities in contemporary Japanese literature. Moreover, I'm living with a visual impairment. This means that I can draw on my personal experience of disability, but also that I will never read as nicely as I want to. I hope for your understanding. I will start with 3 basic assumptions about disability that apply in Japan and beyond. First, disability is socially constructed. Second, we can only make sense of disability when we understand it as complex, intersectional, and culturally shaped. There is neither something like the disability nor a binary of disability and normate, though the latter is often mobilized in assumptions about and depictions of disabilities. Disabilities are diverse, given forms and grades of severeness, given individual accounts and concerns, given representation in literary and cultural artifacts that could follow an educative, corrective, subversive, reparative, or other agenda. Given concrete social situations and interpersonal relations, given cultural differences deriving from long and complex histories, and given disabled people's right to choose if and how to disclose their disabilities, or even if to identify as disabled. Third, as to experiences, concerns, theoretic approaches, and so on, we can't overlook fundamental parallels between disability studies and other studies. In Japan, both tensions and contradictions concerning disabilities can be observed. Disability is perceived as a difference and thus not necessarily as positive. Current debates on disability always also must be considered in light of a long and complex history of stigmatization and discrimination against people with disabilities. Second, Japan has made tremendous advances in providing physical accessibility. Given the diversity and complexity of disabilities as well as Japan's small-scale environments, this undoubtedly is not an easy job. And it is a job not yet accomplished, as the photo on the right exemplifies. It shows one of the countless open-air staircases in the Tokyo metropolitan area, accessible to visually impaired people, but not to wheelchair users. Third, ongoing segregation in schooling, housing, and the labor market exist. Only 19% of working-age disabled people are in employment. Fourth, it's rather international than domestic political pressure that works towards the institutionalization of disability rights. Fifth, disability rights are primarily settled at the prefectural level. Sixth, we see a growing public interest in disabilities in Japan as well as revised legislation. Both derive from what's commonly discussed as Japan's most focal challenges: demographic change and a shrinking workforce. 7. Japan's self-image as well as visions of future are characterized by technological innovations, mirroring the narrative of progress through growth that has shaped Japan's identity since the second half of the 19th century, and even more intensely since the post-war period. As Jennifer Robertson, in her highly influential analysis Robo Sapiens Japonicus shows, these represent hopes for future corporate profits and must as well be understood as strongly politicized visions of future, also as a strategy to preserve, to avoid change, for example, with regard to gender roles, and to restrict migration. Digital technologies play a major role in future narratives of disabilities as well. Now, how is accessibility through digital technologies depicted in Ichikawa Sao's Hunchback? Ichikawa Sao, born in 1979, is a Japanese writer. She is physically disabled due to a congenital myopathy and trained in disability studies. Hunchback, first published in 2023, is Ichikawa's first novel of so-called high literature. The novel is a prime example of literary works depicting disabilities published recently. It tells the story of Isawa Shaka, a physically disabled woman in her 40s. The protagonist is disabled due to a congenital myopathy. She must use a wheelchair, is placed on a ventilator, and spend most of her day in a small apartment in a residence for disabled adults. Hunchback depicts a physical disability authentically and informed by experiential knowledge. It also addresses disability studies, debates, and theories such as disabled women's sexual and reproductive rights or the impact of the ADA on Japan's debates on disability. It tackles major strands of disability discourse such as labor and poverty, hospitalization and treatment, isolation and dependence, and degendering and desexualizing. It includes Twitter posts and Kotatsu articles to be published in a blog. These do not only enable Shaka to imagine herself in other constellations that block out what for her seems impossible or taboo, but they contribute to the contestation and rewriting of disabled people's lives. Hunchback depicts an individual experience of disability by contrasting disabled with the normate. It contests disability as a phenomenon that is socially constructed. The protagonist has experienced herself as the disabled other since her early childhood. This, as she lets us know, has a lot to do with being seen and labeled as the disabled other, a label that enforces injustice. Hunchback introduces two sorts of assistive technology. These are firstly a ventilator and wheelchair, which for the physically disabled protagonist Shaka are an absolute necessity to live and navigate. And secondly, an iPad. This standard device used for entertainment, work, and so on for the severely disabled protagonist is a game-changing assistive technology that renders access to a sphere otherwise hardly open to her. Contrasting the protagonist with non-disabled, the novel tells about living a disability, focusing on reading, which still too often means reading a printed book. It explores barriers restricting access to literature. In a digital age, these barriers should rather be considered as made than as inevitable. An iPad is constantly accompanying the protagonist and remedies several physical barriers she is confronted with. Her iPad renders reading books possible for her, as she can lift it due to its lightweight, turn the pages easily, and get access to big books without having to go to a bookstore or library, places often not or not fully accessible to wheelchair users. It thus contributes to achieving autonomy and leveling injustice. Further, Shaka's use of an iPad enables her to write and to submit her Twitter and blog posts, which she understands as her link to society. Unlike most depictions of digital technologies in literary works, the novel presents digital devices and social networks as tackling and also as mirroring loneliness and social isolation, but never as creating it. As exemplified in Hunchback, a standard device like an iPad can be facilitated as assistive technology. What helps has neither to be a high-end device, but can also be a device that is available anyway and can be adapted to individual needs. Nor has it to be a device designed as assistive technology. These are much too expensive, technically outdated, and often raise compatibility issues. Now let me come to my hypothesis on disability and IA. I formulate these departing from my reading of Hunchback, personal experience, and relevant research literature, taking a disability studies approach to AI. AI is part of the world we live in. No one can opt out of using it. AI requires new skills and knowledge, while by no means making existing obsolete. It will transform our understanding and our doing of the world, contemporality, work, sociality, and so on. Accessible AI is nothing less than a basic prerequisite for inclusive societies. Currently, AI technologies are at risk of reproducing access restrictions already existing. As Bedou Ashley and Virginia Grande in their paper Forgotten Again elaborate, Gen AI technologies were, quote, predominantly developed by able-bodied individuals, and major companies' inclusivity guidelines, quote, often claim universal applicability, but notable lack a focus on accessibility. But when AI is not accessible, this excludes and marginalizes disabled people. It restricts them in almost any aspect of their lives, including educational and labor opportunities. However, accessibility, as previously stated, is complex and not a bug fix. My accessibility is not the accessibility of another visually impaired or blind person, and not at all that of someone with physical, hearing, or intellectual impairment. Equally, accessibility is shaped depending on cultural contexts and concrete social settings. There is the risk that AI reproduces or even enlarges existing disability injustices. For example, the datasets that models are trained with could, as Ashley and Grande state, neglect differences and reproduce or even strengthen hegemonies and hierarchies. On the other side, increasing representation in datasets, as Cynthia Bennett and Oskis argue, quote, will be complex given disability politics. Likewise, tensions among competing values such as safety versus personal expression and autonomy and privacy arising in IA, as discussed by Alex Fianneca et al., must be balanced in order to facilitate AI as a technology that is open to all, respecting individual needs, authority, and freedom. However, none of these issues is only true for AI. Rather, these are in one way or another given in pragmatic reality, of which AI is part, of course. A disabled person's right to express freely can be restricted, no matter if a relative or a caretaker or if otherwise an LLM ends their sentence. Regarding disability justice, whether a visual impaired person takes a photo of, for example, a PowerPoint presentation or directions at a train station or uses an IA image description tool, will not be judged differently. The same applies to both the friend describing to a blind person what or whom they see, or the same blind person's using a wearable like Google Glasses. However, both might be considered inappropriate or harmful by those described or watched. But disability justice is not the only thing we must consider. Both for the user and third parties, it plays a role when data is collected, stored, and accessed, and which knowledge about people and objects is created through AI. However, we must be reminded that no matter what assistive technology is used, disability justice can only be approached by creating an overall social climate that honestly values diversity. Nothing about us without us. This is a well-known claim articulated by disability rights activists around the world since the 1960s. It is instructive to the scholarly field of disability studies and should also be to AI engineers and researchers. Subsequently, AI should not only be made for disabled users, but with and by them. People with disabilities, and more generally, people belonging to diverse demographic groups, should be involved in testing new technologies and updates at any stage. They are the ones that ensure that AI technologies offer flexibility to heterogeneous needs and contexts. This does not only require tech companies to hire disabled engineers and universities to train disabled people in informatics, but also guidelines and policies that acknowledge the experiences and needs of diverse user groups. We must contest the impact that AI and other technologies have on their users' way of thinking and feeling, on their way of perceiving, trusting, and questioning themselves, on their confidence in valuing their experiences, and not least, on their autonomy in analyzing, judging, and decision-making. And finally, it's always about adapting technologies to us, not us to technologies. As Merida, Whitaker et al. Elaborate, quote, much of the AI targeted at disabled people implicitly promises to make them more like non-disabled people, based on an implied understanding that non-disabled is the norm, end of quote. We must acknowledge that neither AI nor any other technology must validate whether or to which extent a human is a human. And it never can or should aim to solve or to overcome disability, as we should not strive for a world without disabilities, but for a world that is livable for all and that values any diversity as inherent to human existence. Thus, we must address and adjust social structures rather than individual differences. While using AI technologies, we must maintain a critical perspective on risks and limitations. All these concerns require guidelines, legislation, and so on. So, we can never accept the enforced use of technology, no matter how sound its benefits appear to experts, medical doctors, judges, or the public. That's what we should already have learned from debates about cochlear implants and prostheses. To conclude, I argue that an individual's experiences, social contexts, literary works, and AI are by no means distinctly definite. All these scapes are the world we live in. Regarding emerging and existing AI technologies, we need to train new skills and mustn't ignore upcoming risks. At the same time, we can, as ever, refer to critical approaches already elaborated and to experiential and epistemic knowledge achieved about disabilities. Acknowledging the diversity of disabilities and any other intersectionalities, dialogue with and inclusion of those affected is required in any context and at any stage. As tensions among diverse interests and groups can't be avoided, these must be debated and balanced so that any technology offers flexibility for heterogeneous needs and contexts. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I believe that a translation of Hunchback is either now out or is coming out. So I think yes, I think it's coming out in March next year, and I absolutely can't wait to read it. So yeah, thank you so much. I now want to hand over to our third speaker, Aisha Sobey. And so Aisha is going to be presenting on the hidden expectations of self-tracking apps, who really benefits, which is an incredibly prescient topic right now. And so Aisha Sobey is an interdisciplinary scholar and research associate at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, University of Cambridge. She is concerned with understanding the embedded power within digital systems, specifically the way we design expectations of normal and deviant bodies to health apps and healthcare systems. And in doing so, Aisha seeks to explore alternative design paradigms which could support rather than marginalize those seeking care. And so she is passionate about inclusion and accessibility, which both influence her work and her artistic practice. So thank you so much, Aisha, and you can take us away.
Thank you so much. Oh, thank you so much, Kerry. So I think some of this has already been touched upon by the talks already, which has been fantastic. So we're going to have some parallels going on. And I just want to flag that this kind of work that I'm presenting now is ongoing with Dr. Milena Ivanova, who is a philosopher, and I come from a kind of political economic background. So yeah, it's a real interdisciplinary project. So please forgive me if my use of philosophical terms is a little bit shady. So I think, yeah, Kerry mentioned AI hype, and that is something that is really driving a lot of these things forward. We sort of see AI in the UK context, at least, being positioned as something that's going to shape the future of healthcare and be foundational to the NHS and the health service moving forward. We have some really kind of good examples of AI for healthcare research. I always like to start with this slide to just sort of say, hey, look, I'm not totally anti-AI for health. The idea that there are 200 million known proteins, and it took decades for human researchers to figure these kind of shapes out, but this AI system, AlphaFold, does allow this to happen within kind of weeks and months as opposed to years. So it's really speeding up this health research paradigm. However, what I'm going to focus on today is the apps and the places where humans are interacting with these systems on a much more granular level. So maybe you've seen an advert, such as in Amy's presentation, or maybe you've sought something out to help you. And this is going to have a look at what happens when people are interacting in these health app systems. Health apps can be positioned as support in our pockets, a cheaper, easier way to deliver healthcare, and sometimes they're seen as a way of empowering individuals to gain sort of self-knowledge and power over their health by for example, tracking something and being able to say, no, this is a genuine problem over this period of time. Please, I want to do something about this. And this could be seen to be supported by the quantified self, which was a movement that started in the early 2000s, but has really greatly benefited from technologies that allow, digital technologies that allow us to kind of track and identify patterns within the world. And they sort of say they have started from a position that if you track and you look at the right data, you can sort of help yourself. They do make a large caveat that that self-tracking is very individual, and what works for one person may not work for someone else. However, this as we'll see as we go forward, maybe has got lost a little bit in the translation of the kind of the ethos of the quantified self as a collection of individuals seeking to understand more about themselves and moving into the real world spaces of how it's been operationalized in real life. So I think data bias in medical trials, in medicine at all, is a really important thing to think about. So we have known for a long time that women and women's pain especially have been sort of ignored by the medical community in lots of instances, and that by and large the sort of the male able body is the default human, that means that this is the subject that gets studied in clinical trials. This is and if you deviate from that central concept, you then are sort of start to be less well represented by the information we have. So Milena and I wanted to consider epistemic injustice. So what we know and how we know things, and also hermeneutical injustice, which is the kind of what is canonical or valid or proper in the ways of interpreting information that have in a long time been seen as a barrier to healthcare, because if someone is suffering with pain over a long term, how do they prove that? How do they show that? It's this invisible thing that can sometimes take a very long time to get a diagnosis. And maybe there's a kind of a way that this kind of these sort of technologies could be reclaiming this space. So femtech as a medical technology was developed. Femtech isn't one thing, it's a collection of different technologies, but different technologies that fall under the moniker of femtech tend to address women's health. And lots of these can be related to women's health around pain and reproductive health, which are both things that get kind of minimized by traditional medical knowledge. But femtech is also big business. So since 2013, is it 13? Yes, 2013, there's been an incredible rise in the amount of money that is expected or made through femtech. So from 500 million only to 27 billion. And the green growth you can see in this graph is actually just showing companies that were made in 2015 onwards. So there's been a real kind of explosive growth in these technologies, which brings me to the sort of question, if these things are we through femtech trying to bring marginalized groups in to something that is only making the original purpose of the data or the algorithm or what's being made better? So this is a great quote from Stevens and Keyes, who sort of say that if data sets that underrepresent people of color are being used to train models for policing, border control, and other forms of state control and violence, an improved model will only provide greater accuracy for law enforcement agencies. And, you know, if they are only being used to train systems for surveillance capitalism, then efforts to increase representation are merely efforts to increase the ability of commercial entities to exploit, track, and control people of color. And I would argue that this concept or type of thinking applies to digital technologies and self-tracking, and potentially femtech, though it started from a very good place, that as it brings more people into the large state algorithms, it serves only to exacerbate the problems we have in our society. But if we take a little look at these sort of apps that we get, the business model that these apps are built with, they aren't designed to sort of support you, create a new habit or a report and set you free. They're designed to support you and make you reliant on their service so you keep going back. And this is kind of like speaks to Amy's discussion of the surveillance and the data collection that is going on. They've been shown to sort of like, there's a whole canon of literature in human-computer interaction studies which talks about leveraging 15 different cognitive biases that we as humans have, that designers of technologies are using to try and get user attention to make us change behaviors. But if we're using these apps and we're self-tracking, the goals of these systems are always set by the designers. That the company and the designer are choosing the optimum standard that we should aim for. And for Lupton, this is problematic because you can't have a kind of number or standard without it becoming a personal goal. And more kind of insidiously, there is this increasing growth of surveillance that, again, Amy discussed in her kind of the ads that you're getting. But once you sign up to the product, this kind of exponentially increases because there is this idea that you kind of can't give the system enough data, that no data is useless, no data is unneeded. And the fetishization of big data ends up meaning that sort of data is the solution to all human problems. But we don't know what they're doing with that once they have it from a healthcare perspective. And I think this is also, when we think about goals and tracking, there are also potential harms. So the design choices that are embedded in lots of these self-tracking apps, Ike and Gorsuch have also sort of evidenced the sort of the harms that this causes for people with eating disorders using fitness trackers, but also we've got kind of unintended consequences. That is a kind of lots of these human-computer interaction articles will kind of go, oh yeah, and there were some intended consequences, but we're going to try and reduce them. And this area kind of gets ignored or pushed to the side in how we report a lot of the time. But we don't know what unintended consequences are coming from these things, which I think Amy's work really speaks to, and maybe that's a way to sort of start investigating that. I mean, from a personal example, if you think of Google Maps, I now travel journeys that I used to travel without Google Maps, but if it's red, I'm angry about the traffic now, that it didn't happen beforehand. And I wonder if that this kind of color coding and the way that things are designed really setting people up for a feeling something. So that has been a whistle-stop tour through private healthcare apps. And I just wanted to, we're going to zoom in quite quickly, a case study of Alaris C19YRS, which was actually the award-winning digital platform that was used to support COVID-19 long COVID sufferers by the National Health Service in England and Scotland. It has been touted as a real kind of great support, and this app was used to support people with so that they could track their symptoms over time. And it says in the kind of the blurb here that customizable support resources for local services. However, if we take a look at what the questions are asking, it's what they ask sort of about breathlessness, complications, mobility, sense of well-being, and all of these things are asked on a pre-COVID basis. How did you feel before COVID, and how do you feel now that you have long COVID? And there isn't much guidance given to users on how often they're supposed to do this. So it begs questions of kind of, are people only doing this when they feel their worst, which would skew the results? Are people only doing this when they feel well enough and they have the capacity to do this, which would also make the self-reporting somewhat unreliable? But actually, the interesting bit starts as we start to move into cognitive symptoms, where the way the questions are designed, again, seem to indicate that some of these things are expected. And I think similar to kind of Amy's self-reflection, people using these systems kind of, the way that these questions are formed shapes people's, could well be shaping people's answers. And these are all, again, on a pre and post-COVID basis. But I think the most egregious example is how severe is the anxiety you're experiencing, or how severe is the depression you're experiencing. And both of these questions, even though you can answer 0 and say no, nothing, really set the user up to report, yes, I'm feeling something like that, which can be really unhelpful for how people recovering. Whilst they can be useful to reflect, there's no clear system within the app as you're using it as to how any of these answers would actually get you any support. So you can answer 10 and nothing happens. So there's a kind of a real a black box issue going on with what information you're putting in and what you're getting out. So this was a public healthcare service, but we don't know where the data's gone. We don't know what it's been used for, and we don't know how helpful it's been to anyone. So Milena and I have kind of been thinking about this, and we sort of question if the patient experience or the patient can overcome this knowledge injustice by using digital health apps. What is the cost of using these apps? And we sort of identify that there's actually just a really high burden of proof that continues on the patient when you're using these things, to log things, to ensure that the data is right, that it's reflective. And if you're undergoing pain or different physical or mental health problems, then your capacity to undertake this tracking is lower as well. The cost of datafication, this like tick box and scale answers, can be really detrimental to how we want to express what's going on for us. Maybe it's none of those things. I just wanted to tell my doctor something else. But if you have to do it through a set way, this quantification can be difficult. And similarly, the widening of access gaps of people using these systems and people who just can't. And I also wonder if it's creating a kind of hermeneutical expectation that we have to do this in a certain way to get a diagnosis of pain or an invisible kind of condition. Do we have to track over time and express this in the form of a kind of neatly packaged graph for my doctor to believe me? And I question that as a is that really a good thing? And I think then we kind of have some broader issues that I will happily talk about this junk science case study in our discussion session later, discussion time later, if anyone's interested. But I think we don't know the undesired consequences. Will these things increase public mistrust because we're not getting anything out of them? And lots more data is not necessarily better. And I know loads of people have been saying that for a very long time. But I think this sort of, these case studies really do express there is all this data about COVID sufferers now. And it's just gone into this kind of imaginary, this ether that no one has, nothing's been done from it, and they're not telling us what's being done with it, as an example. And this is even worse when it's then private companies keeping this data, because it's probably being sold. That's my cheery note to end on. Thank you very much for listening.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, I think it's been really fascinating to hear the interplay between all three presentations and the kind of intermixing between these kinds of technical and design questions with these much broader political, social phenomena when it comes to the production and understanding of disability.